Hey guys, I'm Ben, I'm an architect and a permaculture designer, and in this video I'm going to answer 10 compost questions that you guys have asked me. I'm going to bust some myths and give you guys some game-changing tips. We'll discuss rats, what you can and can't put in the compost, sifting, persistent herbicides, and plenty more. So a bit of context before we dig in. I have a large backyard garden where I grow hundreds of kilos of fruit and veg and eggs. And in order to feed that garden, I have an integrated chicken composting system where I produce 10 cubic meters of compost every year. And I made a video all about it and I got lots of questions in the comments section. So today I'm going to answer 10 of them. So the most common question I got was, how do I deal with rats in my composting system? Chewy Hunan says, how do you prevent rats from the compost piles? I got a whole family of huge rats. I've got Common Future here saying, I just have a tumbler composter and you've made me realize I need something like this. How do you avoid rats though? Love of Dirt said, I'd love to compost like this, but space limits me and I'm not keen on rodents, so can't give chickens too many scraps. And finally, Tom Joy 1109 says, with your method, how do you deal with rats, if at all? Maybe the chickens are doubling up as security. So I want to start by saying it's probably unreasonable to expect that you're ever going to completely eliminate the risk of seeing a rat in your compost area. I occasionally see a rat or a mouse in my backyard, but I'm okay with that so long as they're not in the house. If you are seeing a few rats or mice or you're worried about them becoming an issue, then let's talk strategies for dealing with them. I think there's two main ways that you can deal with rodents: limiting their food supply and predators. So let's talk about limiting their food supply first, because if they haven't got anything to eat, then it's much less likely that they're going to hang around in your compost area. So rodents are going to be most attracted to high calorie food scraps. Things like dairy, meat, nuts, and grains or grain products like bread or pasta. They might also be attracted to fruit and vegetable scraps, but probably less so. So in my system, these food scraps don't hang around long, and that's because of the chickens. And they'll eat these kinds of foods long before any rodent gets a chance. But if you don't have chickens, don't throw your food into landfill. There are other solutions. If, for example, you have a small system and you're composting in one or a couple of bins, then you can exclude rodents pretty easily just by covering the bottom with mesh. But make sure that the mesh is big enough so that bugs and worms can still fit through. You can also enclose larger compost bays in a similar way, but it's going to take some thought to make sure that it's sturdy and durable. If you're making larger piles that aren't contained to a bin or a container like me, then what you can do is you can put all your food scraps in a bucket and you can inoculate them with bokashi grain, and then you can leave them in that bucket until you're ready to make a pile. So if you've limited their food supply, but you've still got some rodents hanging around because they've made a lovely little nest in one of your compost piles, then your next option is predators. In my case, the predators are the chickens. The chickens spend most of their time hanging out around the compost piles, and believe it or not, chickens are quite adept at catching rodents. I've seen one of my chickens eat a mouse whole that came scurrying out of a compost pile after I'd lifted the tarp off. But if you don't have chickens and you're not interested in getting any, then the other obvious predator for rodents is cats. So you could consider getting a cat or encouraging a neighborhood cat to hang around your compost area. But beware, I had a cat when I was a kid who was very good at catching rats, but he also loved to show off his kill, and he'd often leave half a rat as a lovely little gift on our front step. Finally, if you don't want chickens or a cat, then you could be the predator if you're comfortable with that, and you could use traps to catch them. But I would strongly discourage you from using poison, because if any local wildlife eats a rat that's been poisoned, then it will also be poisoned, and that will continue up the food chain. Anne-Marie says, great video, I have access to plenty of manure, but I'm worried about broad spectrum herbicides that have been used in the feed. Do you have any thoughts on this? Thank you. Yeah, so I think this is a really important topic to discuss, because herbicide contamination in manure does seem to be a pretty global issue that lots of people are experiencing. It is something that you really need to be aware of. There are herbicides that persist in manures and will persist throughout the whole composting process. When you grow your plants in that compost, they will then seriously affect the health of those plants and cause plant deformities and nutrient deficiencies and other issues. So my solution to this is pretty simple. It's just know where your manure comes from. And if you know where your manure comes from, then either it comes from you or it comes from someone you know, and you can ask them, what animals produce this manure? Were they fed feed that had herbicides sprayed on it? If the person you're getting the manure from can't answer that question, then don't take the manure. It's that simple. Given how much of a problem this can be if you do introduce persistent herbicides into your garden, I think it's best to play it absolutely on the safe side. This next says, you put coffee grounds in the chicken area. And 94 Fadil says, do you put bones in your compost? What should not go into the compost? So, coffee grounds, first of all. Some people are concerned about chickens eating coffee and that they shouldn't eat coffee, but in my experience, chickens are not at all interested in eating the coffee grounds, so that's never been an issue for me personally. Bones, I do add to the compost pile and they do slowly break down. I think probably what happens is they just kind of end up cycling through the composting system until they eventually break down. In terms of generally speaking, what should I and shouldn't I add to my compost pile is a slightly nuanced question because it again depends on your composting setup. If you're making large hot compost piles like me, then you can pretty much put anything in it. I like to follow the motto that if it's lived, it can live again. But everything also has to be balanced. So you don't want to be adding kilos and kilos of orange peels into a compost pile, or eggshells, or meat, or dairy, or something like that, right? It has to be balanced out in the same way that all ingredients need to be balanced out in a compost pile. If you're making compost just in a smaller bin or a tumbler, then your piles probably aren't going to be heating up as much, and so I suppose you do need to be more cautious about adding materials that are not going to decompose as quickly or are going to attract pests. But so long as you've got a balance of materials and you're able to exclude those pests with methods that we've already discussed, then you should be able to compost most things. The next question is about sifting, and it's from Mal123. Is sifting important? I mean, is it possible to use the compost without sifting? And another question is, what do you do with the unbroken material that comes from the sifting process? Did you compost it again with new raw material? Okay, so firstly, is sifting important? Well, it depends. It depends on what you're going to do with the compost at the end of the process. For me, it is important because I use my compost in my seed raising mix. I start all of my plants from seed, and in order to do that, I usually sow them in trays in my greenhouse in spring or throughout the year. But if you're not using your compost to make seed raising mix, then maybe you don't need to sift. If all you're doing is spreading your compost on garden beds and you don't mind a bit of lumpy material on top, then it's probably fine unsifted. And then so the question is, after I've sifted it, what do I do with all of that rougher material that ends up on the other side of the sifting process? Well, two main things. I either return it to the top of my composting system where it gets composted again, or if the material's not too chunky, what I'll do is I'll just spread it on some of my garden paths. Selmarie6494 says, can you show how you made the sifter? Okay, so I'm in the composting area and this is my A-frame sifter. So the way I made it is really pretty simple. I actually found these timber frames on the side of the road. So that was super easy. So I didn't have to make the frame, but you could easily make them just by cutting the timber to size and just screwing them together. Because then you're going to put the mesh on top, and the mesh actually helps brace the frame. So it doesn't matter if you initially make the frame and it's wobbling around, it's going to stiffen it right up. So the mesh I used has 25mm holes, and that works pretty well. But I've also got an extra frame which I sit on top, which is about 12mm spacing or so. And so to screw the mesh on, you can use really any method you want. I just got these thin strips of timber and then just screwed that timber into the frame just with some washers under the screw. And then the timber effectively clamps that whole edge of the mesh in place. So at the top of the frame, all I've done is just screw in a single hinge in the middle. Then that attaches to either frame, and that just means that I can open it up. Oh, look out, and then I can adjust it to be as open or as closed as I like. Ideally, I would have used two hinges, but I only had one at the time, and so I just did that, and I've never added another one because I haven't really needed to. It does wobble side to side a little bit, but honestly, it doesn't bother me. Angel Prissy says, in the video, it looks like the material being sifted by an A-frame mostly just slides down in a pile on the non-sifted side. Would a horizontal sift angle work more efficiently? Okay, so the main benefit for me using an A-frame sifter as opposed to a horizontal sifter is that gravity does the work. When you use a horizontal sifter, like say over a wheelbarrow or something like that, particularly if your sifter is heavy, it's quite a lot of work to have to agitate the compost back and forth so that the material falls through. When you've got an A-frame sifter, the mesh is on an angle, and so the material falls down it, and as it falls down, the smaller material falls through and the chunkier material falls off. And the beauty of the A-frame is that you have the ability to open up or close the sifter depending on how fast you want that material to run through. So a couple of questions about materials. June Shannon 8074 says, where did you get your mesh and how much did it cost? I've priced mesh at Bunnings and it was so expensive. Yes, so welded wire mesh in Australia does seem to be pretty hard to come by secondhand, and new it is quite expensive. And often when you do find it secondhand, it's just as much as when you buy it new. You can find larger sheets on places like Facebook Marketplace, and I just recently bought 6 larger panels. I think they were 2400 by 1200 and they were $35 a panel, so pretty good value for what you're getting really. Mark Higgins says, thanks heaps, where did you get those low woven barriers? I actually got them for free. They were sitting on one of my fences, but since getting that question, I've looked it up and you can actually get these. They're readily available at Bunnings. Okay, Ethan Johnson 2405 says, wanted to clarify, after you pile it up and cover it with the tarp, do you leave it covered with the tarp for 1 to 2 months until you're ready to turn it? And Sip Steel says, are the chickens only scratching through it in the first phase? Can you clarify how they're reacting after you cover it? I guess I'm confused at what stages the chickens are involved when I see you covering the piles. So the answer to this is a little bit nuanced, and it really kind of depends on a few factors. Generally speaking though, after I've made a pile, I'll cover it with a tarp and I'll leave it covered unless I want the chickens to access it. If you want your compost pile to decompose quickly and evenly, it's really best practice to keep it covered. It'll happen a lot faster, and otherwise, unless you live in a really wet climate, it'll dry out pretty quickly. And so usually when the pile's been sitting for about a month or so, and I feel like the chickens need access to some worms or some bugs, I'll take the tarp off, and usually at that point I'll actually turn the pile down the hill and I'll let the chickens scratch through it. But as I'm turning it, I'm also making sure that I'm not letting them get every last worm, because I want the population to be able to recover. So the vast majority of that life cycle of one compost pile moving through the system, it's covered with a tarp, but there will be moments throughout where I'll take the tarp off, I'll either be turning it or I'll be letting the chickens scratch through it, or both. Okay, so I am Judy 1111 has asked a similar question. Having the chickens come through again as you are sifting, doesn't that introduce manure too late into the process? It's a good question and something that hadn't really occurred to me when I was making the original video. But yeah, it's actually not an issue letting the chickens scratch through that finished compost pile to pick out any worms and bugs before you sift. And you might think that as they scratch through, they're going to manure into that pile and you're not going to want to put that in your garden. But you might only get 1 or 2 droppings in there from the chickens. And in the scheme of a whole compost pile, it's really not going to be an issue that you're going to notice in your garden. So thank you everyone for all of the questions, and hopefully if you've made it to this point in the video, then that means that you've gotten something out of it. If you've got any other questions about compost, then let me know in the comments below and I'll happily answer them. And if you want to see more from me, then hit that like button and subscribe.